He notes, I'm a 33-year-old biracial African-American. My father's white. I would have been no less a slave for that in 1820, no freer in the Jim Crow South in 1920. No less slave for that in 1820, I think I should have said. No freer in the Jim Crow South in 1920. But in 2020, I can look back fondly on my childhood in multicultural Culver City, California. I trusted teachers. I trusted our local politicians whose children I knew. I trusted the police. 15 miles away in the Jordan Downs Project in Watts, a 4-year-old girl was trapped in a war zone. The woman I would marry 15 years later remembers gunfire and the explosions. She remembers the sirens and the impotent efforts of authorities to gain control as her neighborhood erupted. She remembers innocent people caught in the crossfire. That was the beginning of my wife's experience. Gangs, a failing education system, the abuses of law enforcement. This is the lens through which many Black Americans see their future. It is a present implied by the bitterness of the past. And so he asked some questions for consideration, given the different experiences he had growing up as compared to his now wife. The pain is real, but so is the progress that our ancestors fought for and realized. Do we conserve and build on it in search of Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community? Or do we reject an American project for which our own people have sacrificed so much? This is a conversation for all Black America. It's a conversation for all those who would stand with us. Great question. Do we conserve and build on all the progress our ancestors fought for and realized, or do we reject an American project for which our own people have sacrificed so much? For more on that, we're pleased to be joined by Kina Collins, nationally recognized gun violence prevention and healthcare advocate. Kina, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dan. Hey, Amy. Thank you so much for having me.
What about that question that John Wood Jr. raises, the choice before all of Black America and all those who stand with Black Americans?
I think that we are in a time where we can, men lie, women lie, numbers do not. And we are living in a state of emergency in Black America. And whether that's through state-sanctioned police violence and brutality or, rapid gunfire that is happening through intracommunal violence, those are things that we're still working on. But what I think the movement for Black Lives is trying to say is that no longer can you write policy about us without us. And so bringing to the forefront all these issues that historically, since the inception of Black people coming to America, which was stolen labor, us being brought here forcefully, now we see all of the generational impacts that has had up until present day. And while we can talk about a variety of successes and victories that we've had as a collective, there's so much more that's left to do.
Do you think Juneteenth should be a national holiday? I know some companies are giving a pay date off, Nike's, Twitter, Uber.
I think that we should commemorate the holiday. Here's what I think. I think that oftentimes we get caught up in this. So I do support Juneteenth being a national holiday. However, the place that I'm at right now, after the recent events that have occurred, really in these last 2 years, and even we could talk about in the last 5 years here in the city of Chicago after the Laquan McDonald protest, I don't just want, as a young Black American, I don't just want symbolic victories anymore. I want policy and implementation to change the systemic root of these problems. And so, we could talk about national holidays and the commemoration, but it means absolutely nothing if Black folks in America are not elevating and if we're still being murdered, like I said, whether that's through intracommunal violence or state-sanctioned police brutality.
So give us an example of a policy or two that you would like to see implemented.
Definitely. I definitely think that healthcare I actually ran for Congress here in the Illinois 7th Congressional District. And in the Illinois 7th, we actually have the largest life expectancy gap in the country. So that basically means if you live in Streeterville, you live to the average age of 90. If
Yes.
you live,
Dan's going to live forever.
Yeah, no, I know.
Dan lives there, so.
No, we've talked about it in this
Yeah,
show.
we have.
I'm in Streeterville, average age 90, and in Inglewood,
And
7
then-
miles away, it's 60. That's right.
Yep, it's 60 years of age. So for me, healthcare is at the top of the ballot for any race, whether you run in a deep red district or a deep blue district. We all have the stories
wait, sorry to interrupt, but wait a second. Danny Davis is your congressman in the 7th congressional district. He's a longtime a politician who's been in positions of power both at the local and now the federal level. What's the problem there?
Well, as I challenged him on the campaign trail, he's taking corporate PAC money from pharmaceutical industry, and like I said, anybody who knows me knows I'm an equal opportunist as far as accountability goes in our politics. And I think that the people should come over profit. So healthcare is the number one thing. I do support a single payer Medicare for all system because I think that it's comprehensive. I think that it includes everybody, specifically here in the African American community, that would have the ability to have full access to quality healthcare. And this is particularly important given what was uncovered through the healthcare disparities of pre-existing healthcare conditions now that the novel coronavirus has broken out. The African American community got hit the hardest. And so that's because why? We have lead in our water. We live in food deserts. It's not enough investment infrastructurally in our communities, and those are things that I want to definitely fight for. And so healthcare is the core of everything.
So would you say that black politicians throughout several generations now, particularly in Chicago and Illinois, have failed the black community?
I wouldn't say all of the black. I mean, that's just generalizations. I think the political system as a whole. I think it just singling out black politicians would be premature. I think we need to look at a wide sweeping all across the board.
Well, you did. You ran against Danny Davis. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, when you talk about,
but if Danny Davis was Asian American, white American, whatever. And he was taking corporate PAC money, and we have the largest life expectancy gap in the country, I'm going to call you out regardless.
Oh, I know.
So it was less about,
isn't that interesting? Right. So then it's about policy. It's not about race.
Yeah, that was essentially what we were running on, is that it is about policy, but it's also the underlining. So if you're trying to make that into an I gotcha question, I'm trying
to understand your position. Is it about policy or is it about race?
So let me go back. It's both, right? Because what we know is that the race impacts the policy and who gets resources. Really? And how do we know that? Because Streeterville is a swanky, whiter, wealthier portion of our district, and Inglewood is a more working class black portion of our district. And that's not just unique to the Illinois 7th Congressional District. You can go all across the country, and I don't think that that's by coincidence.
Well, but wait a second. Danny Davis represents both neighborhoods.
Yeah. So I'm not getting what your point is.
Well, wait, you're saying the rich white areas get more resources and the poor black areas get less resources. Danny Davis represents both, so yeah,
Danny Davis represents. You're right. Okay, so give me.
So is that? So that's not Danny Davis's fault. Okay, go ahead.
So you have to let me answer the question. Danny Davis represents the Illinois 7th Congressional District. Bill O'Reilly. Bill O'Reilly. Brendan. Sorry, yeah. Brendan O'Reilly. He's an alderman in the ward. Michelle Smith is an alderwoman in the ward. That encompass the Illinois 7th Congressional District. And so, once again, it goes back, for me, the fight when I came in and ran for Congress in the Illinois 7th Congressional District was about taking on corporate interests versus the working class families, which is overwhelmingly what our district is. And that's what we really, essentially what the voters were talking to us about as well. And so it was white elected officials and it's black elected officials here in the city of Chicago.
Yes, exactly. And the white and the black city officials, what do they have in common?
I mean, I think that corporate money has it plays too big of a role in our policy making. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. Number two, I also do believe that vulnerable communities and on the west sides and south sides of the city of Chicago, which are black enclaves of the city of Chicago, historically have been ignored, especially the neighborhood that I'm from, the Austin neighborhood. Mm-hmm. We still haven't recuperated from 1968, from the King riots. They still haven't rebuilt small businesses over here. Right. And so I don't think that is a coincidence either. So there was a multitude of things. I think that agitated voters in our district that we heard from And I think historically, if we're going to talk about public policy, we also have to talk about the historical context behind how municipal and federal and state all play a role in how these resources are allocated. The Vortiac 29, which was a group of white aldermen when Harold Washington was elected, and that was right around the time that Danny K. Davis was elected into city council. They intentionally blocked resources here on the west side of Chicago and south side. That is a fact. That's not how any. And I mean, they were upset that the first African American mayor was elected. Yeah. Those are the historical facts.
I know. I'm not interested in defending any Democrats for the last 100 years in Chicago. That's the other thing they have in common.
Well, we can agree on that.
well, okay. So there you go. So I mean, so this is the thing. And frankly, the recent past, there's been enough of a probationary period for a lot of other politicians who suggest they're in solidarity or are elected to serve their black constituents in these majority black wards, majority black legislative districts, majority black congressional districts, or plurality black congressional districts where blacks have significant political power. And it just hasn't worked out that way. And by the way, that's sort of the story nationally over the last 50 years. If you look at where black representation was in, say, the House or the Senate in 1965 versus where it is in 2019, and that includes governor's mansions and around the country too. And yet in urban centers like your neighborhood, the neighborhood you grew up, Austin, arguably across many quality of life metrics, as we were discussing, the quality of life has actually declined for black Americans in those neighborhoods, in those districts over the last 50 years as representation has increased, as political power has increased. How do you explain that? If it's about policy, couldn't it be that the whole mentality, the whole policy agenda of big city, big government politicians has been wrong? It hasn't helped. It's actually hurt.
No, not necessarily. What we have seen nationally around just politics in general is it is very tribal, number one, and it. For example, I think that on the federal level, if we're talking about the president of the United States of America, the problem that with that argument of big government versus, the government staying out of policy, then we have to keep that across the board. We see full-on attacks for reproductive health care, for example, and not giving women the ability to choose whether they should have the right to abortions and different forms of reproductive health care, right? So for me, I think it goes both ways. And I think that we need a complete overhaul. And that's what we see happening in these protests. Younger people are becoming more politically agitated and more politically engaged in the process. I would also argue that the first piece of civil rights legislation that I ever wrote was House Bill 5544, the Illinois Council on Women and Girls Act. And at the time, Bruce Rauner was still the governor of the state of Illinois. And we know what he did. He created a budget impasse that basically hit communities like Austin the hardest. So even if our state reps were trying really hard to get those resources to us, it was virtually impossible because he would not move on it.
Even if I stipulate to that, which I mean, we could have a discussion about it, but Bruce Rauner was governor for 4 years. Donald Trump has been in office for 3 years. We're talking about a problem.
But these issues are not in a vacuum. They happen generationally.
Exactly. No, exactly. Generationally. I mean, and
so politically, if we're talking politically, black folks in America have not had that much political power if we're looking at the entirety of the political ecosystem of America. That's not true.
Well,
my sister was born in 1981. We are the first generation of African Americans to have full civil liberties given to us. Our parents grew up in Jim Crow. Their parents grew up in the Black Codes, and their parents grew up in slavery.
I don't dispute any of that. The issue is, what's the trajectory? What is the progress being made concurrent with the policies being pursued? And what I see is opportunities and quality of life declining even as political strength is growing. That's the disturbing trend line.
But that's not true. Political strength.
Well,
How are we describing political strength?
I don't
Because we
know. I
see,
mean,
number one,
in Chicago, Lightfoot and Fox and
Preckwinkle.
okay,
Preckwinkle, and
but those
I could go on.
once again, you are talking about symbolic victories. I'm talking about electoral power and policy change. When we talk about what's happening in Georgia, for example, there's real life voter suppression happening in Georgia. There's real life voter suppression happening in Florida. So when we talk about who Black folks can vote for, it's already a hurdle for us to even have the ability to vote in some of these places. And so that's an extra layer and an extra fight that we are putting up with and putting on.
Well, how do you
What
explain?
I will say to you,
Well, how do you explain?
go ahead.
How do you explain Chicago? There's no hurdles electing Black people citywide, countywide here.
Well, the thing about the city of Chicago is that it always has operated. We all know about the Chicago machine. You know, that has always happened. But what we did see in 2015 when the Laquan McDonald tape was released was that we did begin to see cracks in the armor. For the first time in 2019, for the first time ever, we saw the entire Black caucus in the city council primaried. They had challengers. That's the first time that had happened, I think, ever. And that was out of these protests that were springing up. To just kind of fast forward and I mean, like you said, we could have a longer discussion about it. What I was saying, what I'm seeing is a Black millennial, both in the Democratic Party, but just as a Black millennial who's engaged politically. I'm seeing both Black Republican millennials and Black Democratic millennials being upset and frustrated with the entire picture of our political landscape.
Good.
And so I think that in the next few primaries, you are going to see more people run for these seats, younger people run for these seats with a breadth of diversity on the issues. And I think that that's just a natural inclination of what's getting ready to happen.
Well, that's one of the more optimistic things I've heard in the last couple of weeks. So why don't we end on an optimistic, hopeful note? Kina Collins, nationally recognized gun violence prevention and healthcare advocate. Kina, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your comments.
Thank you for having me on.
Take care.
Yeah, have a good day. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Ace is the place with the helpful hardware, folks.
The world's best dads deserve the best Father's Day gifts, and Ace is the best place to find them. We have a great collection of brands dads trust, like outdoor power equipment from Steel and Ego, power tools from Milwaukee, grills from Big Green Egg, Traeger, and Weber, and coolers from Yeti. Find them at your neighborhood Ace or order online for curbside pickup or delivery and make this Father's Day one dad will always remember with gifts he'll love from Ace. At participating stores, see store for details.
Liberty Mutual Insurance Company helps you customize your home insurance so you only pay for what you need. Unlike things you paid for you didn't need, like the Vacnado 2000. A Wi-Fi connected vacuum that